Welcome back to the Monday Steep. The Monday Steep exists to give you the extract from our Rise and Form journey so that we can provide you with the well-steeped tea, the thoughtful and honest real talk inspired by our own Rise and Form journey, and the best moments from the amazing discussions we've had with our guests on the regular show. So let's get into it. I'm not going to lie, I'm not that excited. I'm maybe even a little nervous to dive into today's topic, avoidance. Now, before you tense up and cringe and turn this off, do I really want to hear about this thing I've been avoiding? I promise you do, because we all do it. The reason why I'm focusing the Monday Steep on this is Adam Dell spoke a lot about some themes around avoidance and how it really increases unnecessary suffering. And although there are some examples of when there's healthy and adaptive avoidance, it can also be a trap that holds us back from really living. As a therapist, one of the more common questions I'll ask my clients, particularly when things are getting kind of stale or it feels like there's something that's not being talked about, is, what are you avoiding talking to me about? And usually there's something that comes up that's top of mind. I've had some clients that have been working with me for many months, even years, that took that long to build up the courage to tell me why they were really there. So avoidance is a powerful force because in some ways it's facing other, but in other ways it's about facing oneself. And avoidance can be tricky because we can even have mental avoidance where we don't think about something that we know we need to think about. So let's just think about ways we avoid something that makes us feel anxious. It might be a person that makes us feel anxious. It might be a circumstance, something we need to do that makes us feel anxious. And just think about the typical ways that you avoid. What do you do instead? Now let's just think about how avoiding those things can impact your daily life and your relationships. Perhaps even a hard question to ask is, what would someone say that you avoid typically? So, in a nutshell, what we are talking about is avoiding uncomfortable thoughts, feelings, or situations. Maybe you avoid conflict with people, or there's that ever-growing pile of emails or tasks that you need to get back to. Or sometimes it's something we avoid about ourselves that we just don't really want to think about or focus on, like a sense of inadequacy or a shame we have about ourselves. Avoiding things like this is normal, but it does have a big impact on our mental health. It can provide short-term relief, of course, but it does lead to long-term anxiety, stress, and deeper emotional struggles. It's kind of like trying to outrun a shadow. You're moving, but it's right behind you. Now, in Bible terms, there are some times where avoidance is recommended, such as avoiding unnecessary conflict by being a seeker of peace, or avoiding people who like to quarrel or are not a good influence on you. Titus 3:10 says, "As for a person who stirs up division, after warning him once and then twice, have nothing more to do with him." That makes sense. Romans 16:17, "I appeal to you, brothers, to watch out for those who cause divisions and create obstacles contrary to the doctrine that you have been taught." Avoid them. The Bible does say to avoid in some ways, but the Bible doesn't tell us to neglect or avoid things that we should be responsible for. The word for that, this is a harsh concept. It's called dereliction. Dereliction is the word for neglecting responsibilities or failing to care for yourself, for your relationships, for your family, or doing your job. If we're letting things go and we're not focusing on things that need our attention, we're engaged in dereliction. It's kind of like not mowing your lawn. We know exactly what's going to happen. And even a harsher example is not feeding your children or not doing our job, which means we could get fired. Dereliction is the opposite of diligence, which is a quality of people who are attentive and hardworking and who fulfill their responsibilities. In the Adam Dell episode, he talked a lot about suffering that we inflict on ourselves from these internal rules and narratives that we create. the stories about who we are and who we're not, what we can or cannot do, and where we belong. This self-imposed suffering often leads us to avoid certain situations or emotions as we seek to protect ourselves from pain. However, avoidance only deepens our fear and keeps us stuck. There's some therapies like ACT therapy, acceptance commitment therapy, that really see confronting avoidance as the central mechanism for change. In ACT, they really talk about how, yes, it provides temporary relief, but it becomes a self-perpetuating loop that amplifies anxiety and distress. Ross Harris, a fellow Australian, an expert in ACT, notes that avoidance feeds anxiety, creating a life of ever-shrinking circles. So by avoiding painful emotions or situations, we unknowingly reinforce the belief that those experiences are intolerable, which makes them even more daunting. Now, this can be really true for trauma survivors. They'll say things like, because that happened to me, I can never love again, or I can never trust anyone again. That makes sense, doesn't it? These narratives, that while they're so protective in the moment, they result in further isolation, loneliness, and fear over time. The short-term relief from avoidance, phew, I don't need to deal with that, quickly turns into long-term suffering as fear intensifies and the person feels more stuck than before. So one of the things that can really help us overcome this is to recognize that fear and discomfort are a natural part of living a meaningful life, and that avoiding fear and discomfort can only lead to greater suffering. Harris says this: the moment you stop avoiding your fears, you start reclaiming your life. I can testify to this. Even one of the most trivial conversations I needed to have with a friend who wasn't texting me back, I wanted to ask what was up. And the friend was able to admit to me that they've got some issues going on in their life and it wasn't about me at all. But it was causing me a lot of anxiety because I hadn't actually talked to him about it. So a key theme that Adam Dell was talking about in both therapy and life is that bravery often requires fear as a prerequisite. And in many fairy tales or stories, one must first face their fear to defeat the dragon or embark on the journey. Overcoming avoidance is about reclaiming territory in our minds and our lives, challenging the stories we've told ourselves and daring to take steps towards what truly matters. This is what the Rise mindset's about: rising up, reclaiming our mind's territory so that we can start to write a different story. So if you've been stuck in a pattern of avoidance, breaking free involves not only working through painful memories or fears, but also shifting. So let's just have a look at this through just the Bible lens as well for a moment. There's some clear stories, much like the Hollywood ones that are in the Bible, about confronting fear and overcoming avoidance. One of the most famous stories is David and Goliath. When David was a young shepherd boy, Goliath was a towering, intimidating warrior, and everyone else was avoiding the fight because of fear. But David, with faith, stepped forward. He didn't avoid the challenge, and in doing so, changed the course of history. There's also a lot of examples in probably our own lives, but also in the Bible, of delayed obedience, when God is calling us to do something, but we delay acting on it because it feels uncomfortable or scary. I love this quote, and I don't know where it's from, but it's, "Most of my suffering is because of delayed obedience to God." Most of my suffering is because of delayed obedience to God. And I think about that, I'm like, that's true for me. When we avoid God's calling, we may think we're keeping ourselves safe or comfortable, but what we're actually doing is prolonging our own suffering, because He knows what's best for us. He goes before us. We're missing out on His peace and the blessings that come from stepping into what God has planned for us. So let's just get practical here, and we'll do a couple of forming ideas before we go. One of them I would say is get some guidance. Don't avoid this. This is a good idea to go see someone, either a pastor, a counselor, a wise friend, a mentor, someone that you trust, and ask them to help you see what you might be avoiding and to encourage you to move forward in your faith. Another thing we could do even now is reflect on taking some time to look at the areas in your life you have been neglecting, areas in your life that might have some dereliction to it. Is it in your relationships, in your career, in your work, in your spiritual walk? Have you been avoiding reading the Bible? And what's one step that you can take this week to face that avoidance? So with that, let's finish up. Thanks for tuning into the Monday Steep. Let's all challenge ourselves this week to stop avoiding what's holding us back and instead step into the fullness of what's ahead. We'll see you on Wednesday for a wonderful time with Dr. Catherine Thompson. Dr. Catherine Thompson is a mental health social worker, an academic, a researcher, and an author. She's really passionate about the integration of psychology and theology, and she's written some fantastic books. We've brought her in to talk about her book, The Discipline of Suffering, and how it applies to the fruit of the Spirit, peace. It's a wonderful chat, and I hope you can be there. All right, we'll see you there. Bye. Thanks for listening to the Monday Steep. Whatever is going on in your life, there's always a chance to form your mind and an opportunity to rise again as you cling to your faith in Jesus and yield to his love. We want to thank you for your continued support of the show. If you're liking what you hear, please share it with your friends and follow us on your podcast app and Instagram. We'd love to hear your thoughts too, so drop us some thoughts on our website, riseandform.com.